My book, Captured Freedom, was inspired by a single photograph of 12 men that was shared with me by a neighbor of mine in the North Georgia mountains. And when he showed me the picture, he said, you know, the guy on the far left in the middle is an ancestor of mine. And I was so intrigued by this group of 12 ragged men posing together that I wanted to research it and find out who they all were. The essence of the story is about 9 Union officers who escaped from a Confederate prison called Camp Sorghum in Columbia, South Carolina, and then spent weeks walking more than 300 miles in this unbelievably harsh winter weather conditions into the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. They were helped by 3 mountain guides that they found along the way. One of the guides was only 14 years old. And when they got to Knoxville, they checked in with the local authorities, and then they found a local photographer and had a picture taken. It was like their way of celebrating. It's like, hey, we made it, like a Civil War selfie. When I first began researching it, I discovered this photograph was in several places already. It was in the National Archives, it was in the Library of Congress, and it was in the Chicago History Museum. And the institutions that partially identified the men in the photograph, and in some cases they completely misidentified them. So my main driving force was to try to determine exactly who these guys were. And then I wanted to know what their lives were like. You know, what was it like being a POW? It took, you know, a little bit of time to figure out everybody, and then one guy in particular took a little longer. The person I had trouble identifying, his last name was Ledford. And in the National Archives, their copy of the photograph has the name David Ledford penciled on it. But I knew it couldn't be David because David was dead. The picture was taken on January 2nd, 1865, and David was hunted down and murdered by Home Guards on December 11th, 1864, 3 weeks earlier. They even tortured his wife, Nancy, trying to find him. The family story is that they hung her by her thumbs. This is real Cold Mountain kind of stuff, you know, a chilling true story. But I eventually discovered that the person was Kit Ledford. And Kit was a cousin of David's that lived very close to him in that part of North Carolina. Well, because I had done this genealogical research on everybody, I was able to actually connect with quite a few of the descendants of the men in the photograph. But a lot of them weren't even aware the photograph existed. It's kind of like as time passed, in just a few generations, these stories faded away. And I think the book opened this up to them to kind of understand what their ancestors went through. One of the descendants, you know, when I first talked to her by phone, she said, you know, we're a family of pack rats. And then she proceeded to share with me this cache of letters written between 1882 and 1911 between 2 of the men in the photograph, where they actually discussed the photograph itself. I think they all began imagining what it must have been like for their ancestors to be a POW, maybe what was going through their heads as they faced this horrible condition of being in a prisoner of war camp. So I think it started to become personal and emotional for a lot of them. Captured Freedom is the entire story of these men, where they fought, how they were captured, what their lives were like. You know, this became like a giant scavenger hunt, but I wanted to tell the story of the human element. And, you know, they've been gone now for over 100 years, so I couldn't interview them, but they left a lot of clues along the way to help tell their story. These were officers from regiments from all over the Union, from as far west as Iowa to Illinois, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. There was even an officer from the 19th USCT, which was a regiment of black troops. And combined, they had all fought in just about all the major battles of the Civil War. One guy, the guy in the bottom left, for example, he was reported as killed in action to his wife when he was captured. And he had 3 small kids back in Illinois. And it took her months before she found out the truth. So I believe that this is really an epic Civil War story of survival. Well, since this book was based on this remarkable photograph, I thought it was important to determine who the photographer was who took the photograph. And I determined that Theodore M. Schleyer was the name of the photographer. He originally had a studio in Nashville, and he catered to soldiers, taking their pictures, and these were things that they could have made relatively inexpensively, and they could send home to their loved ones. And in the beginning of 1864, he opened a second studio in Knoxville, and it was coincidentally right next door to the Provost Marshal General's headquarters, which is where the men in the photograph had to go to check in. And so that was just one of the clues that pointed to Schleyer as being the photographer. Well, every time I would research something, and every time I'd pin down a fact, it would lead to more questions and more detective work. And I love that part about writing. It's the research and corroborating stories and all of that. I built full family trees on the men to be able to understand who their ancestors were and who their descendants are that are alive still today. So the book became a lot of personal stories. And even though the book's finished, I'm still researching these guys. I keep turning up things. I mean, the discoveries continue.
Captured freedom. They say every picture tells a story. This one tells many.